So moving on to our next session and our first panel, I'm really excited to start out these next 2 days by exploring the different aspects of nature-based solutions and how they contribute to biodiversity and climate outcomes, and consider how we ensure that equity and communities, again, are centered in this conversation. So, Dr. Jodi Hilty will help moderate our opening plenary session. Jodi's the executive director of the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative, and in addition has been helping to develop the Nature Positive framework and is a leading expert on connectivity and conservation. Joining her will be Dr. Lauren Oakes, a conservation scientist and author based at Stanford University, Dr. Lydia Olander, the director of nature-based resilience at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, as well as program director and adjunct professor at the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University. And finally, Dr. Crystal Upperman, who is a manager at Deloitte and has worked extensively in the intersections of climate, equity, and business. So when we said we have heavy hitter panels, I think, does everybody get it? We have heavy hitter panels? Okay. Please join me in welcoming our panelists and our moderator to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. Today is a really, really serious subject and a really important one. I'm really pleased that the Salazar Center is taking on climate and conservation together. I want to just reflect back for those of you who are younger that it hasn't always been about climate and conservation. The American ABC, American Bird Conservancy, was called the Anti-Green Group. Their mission is to save birds. They were working on a major flyway, and they protested where windmills were going to go in. In the Yellowstone to Yukon region, where I focus a lot of my energy, we were told by a politician as we were protesting a big dam that was going to go in, a hydro dam that was going to stop connectivity for caribou and other critters, that we couldn't possibly protest this. And we would need another dozen of these hydro dams if we were going to solve the climate solution. This was conservation and biodiversity, or climate change, butting heads. We know, though, in both cases, that there's ways around those situations. We also know that there's negatives to dams for both biodiversity and for climate change. But we're going to get to that. So today, this panel right here is going to be setting the stage for nature-based solutions with a lens around science, policy, and equity. So I'm going to turn it over to Lauren. They're going to each make some short remarks. We're going to have a panel. Please, I hope you all know how to input your questions, because I'll be asking some questions for myself, but also questions from the audience. So thank you.
Is that connected? Okay, good. It's an honor to kick off the 5th annual symposium on conservation impact. Thank you all for coming together for the critical conversations that can better inform the actions we take moving forward. Standing before you, I see a room of dedicated people who want to help harness the potential of nature to sustain life, our communities, and ecosystems into the future. Take a step back to the big picture. And we're here in this Anthropocene, this epoch in which human activity is now the dominant force of change, altering the Earth's surface, the atmosphere, our ecosystems, and all the life connected to them. These are the narratives, our narratives, of loss and degradation. The dawn of the sixth extinction, the colliding biodiversity and climate crises that threaten collapse. Yet we are also here together in another unprecedented event in human history, and that is the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, an effort to prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of ecosystems worldwide. People have never collectively endeavored for restoration at such scale. I see hope, and I see opportunity. Nationally, this is the dream of America the Beautiful, to conserve, protect, and restore 30% of our land and water by 2030. We also now have a national climate resilience framework that recognizes adaptation as essential. Building a climate resilient nation means considering climate in all planning, management, and policy processes, and across all sectors. This is progress. There is potential to reverse the trajectories of loss to gain. This is our chance to be a force for positive change. But how? Over the past year and a half, I've interviewed 150 people around the world who are working on restoration in forests specifically for a new book. I have a few insights to offer from this endeavor, but the first today is the recognition of this age where time is of the essence. The need for a rapid response at scale is real. As one ecologist in Hawaii told me, restoration used to be small scale because people were constrained by funding and staff. Now the funding is flying in, and the main thing on everyone's mind is speed. But we have to do this work well to deliver the outcomes that people want, need, and expect. You might be here thinking about how working with nature can safeguard coastal communities from erosions, for example, or how restoring the health of our soils can benefit food security, or how sustaining healthy trees can cool urban neighborhoods, foster community, and yes, also sequester carbon to mitigate climate change. But what's the best approach? That's the question on everyone's mind. For 5 years, I served as a science advisor to the Climate Adaptation Fund, or CAF, one of the biggest and long-running grant-making programs that has supported adaptation in our country. When the CAF launched in 2011 with funding from the Doris Duke Foundation, people weren't really using the terms nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions. Its mission was to make our conservation efforts more resilient to climate change. If people planted species to restore a forest, for example, and they didn't consider what might survive under future climate conditions, the efforts could fail. Without deliberate consideration of climate change risks, they could drown in the rising seas. Our investments could drown in rising seas or wilt during longer droughts. Climate change was and is a motivator for doing things differently. Modifying what actions we take, where, when, and how in order to cope with and adjust to the rapidly changing world. We called this work climate-informed or climate-adapted conservation. Yet looking back over 140 projects, these were also now what we call nature-based solutions, actions to protect, sustainably manage, or restore ecosystems to address societal challenges, improve well-being, and benefit biodiversity. The projects have spanned 48 states, commonwealths, territories, and tribal lands. Our grantees have responded to hurricanes in Florida, for example, and restored dune habitat to protect wetlands, coastal forests, and human communities from future events. They've made California's Central Valley more resilient by creating hedgerow habitat, for example, on farms to serve as corridors and also support pollinators. CAF focused in the early years on protecting biodiversity and improving the health of our ecosystems. Then our targets expanded to include many other services that nature provides people. The evolution seemed to mirror the larger movement toward nature-based solutions, with increasingly more recognition that human health and environmental health are inextricably linked. In 2021, I worked with scientists from the Wildlife Conservation Society and the University of British Columbia to assess, retroactively, what facilitated positive outcomes over time, given that a decade had passed since the earliest CAF projects had been implemented. Although there are plenty of data-driven slides I could present, I'll spare you, let me say that there were clear patterns. Partnerships across agencies, organizations, communities, and cultures are essential. Funding might come from the outside, but implementation and longer-term care must come from within. The goals that people establish early on shape the actions people take and how they track progress. Being more inclusive and open to a range of outcomes at the beginning might offer the greatest possibility for gain. We also saw that building climate resilience demands innovation, and that means learning by doing and troubleshooting along the way. Earlier this year, I traveled to the Azuero Peninsula in Panama to research a forest restoration project that aims to restore biodiverse tropical dry forests at a large scale. I spent a week there, interviewing the project leaders, farmers who are reforesting, and community members collecting seed and caring for backyard nurseries. Collectively, they were rebuilding native forests and integrating trees into other land uses, but they were also restoring communities. The project was providing jobs and much-needed income to landowners in a place where cattle ranching was no longer profitable. It was supporting stewardship training for children in schools and building local capacities. The vision is for water resources to be protected over time. Those future forests can regulate local climate and sequester carbon too. The project leaders were pursuing credits to help fund the effort, but at a high price for high quality, for so much more than just carbon. During one of our many conversations, Andrew, the local operations director, asked me, "Are we doing the right thing?" I wasn't sure if he was actually talking about restoration on the Azuero Peninsula or the global movement itself, and the question was rhetorical anyway. But I thought, this project probably checks every box in the UN sustainability goals, and even he is still questioning what's right, what's best. Andrew continued, "Is this a solution? Is there a better way to do this? There's this enormous movement happening, but nobody seems to really know what they're doing truly because it hasn't been done before. We've had ridiculous situations where hundreds of thousands of the wrong kind of tree were planted in monocultures across the world, for example. Those had consequences, but people still supported the approach and did more of it. Is this the right answer? Is this good? Is there a better way to spend our time and resources? A more efficient way?" He said it's important that everyone involved keeps asking and discussing, are we doing the right thing? Maybe it's less about right and wrong and more about striving for better as people learn from the challenges and successes and what unfolds in this work over time. We are gathered here to share those experiences of success, to identify the hurdles and hard questions and how we might address them. I don't think there will ever be one best approach, only better, continually making this work better together. In 2014, the journalist Michael Hobbs wrote an article in the New Republic about how big ideas destroy international development. It was called "Stop Trying to Save the World," and it went viral. A dear friend, writer, and expert in climate justice, Emily Polk, shared it with me. The story had nothing to do with nature-based solutions explicitly, but I read it carefully, seeing countless connections between his critical look at why attempting to implement one solution at scale doesn't work. He builds off an example of play pump, this merry-go-round hooked to a water pump. The big idea was for children to spin around the colorful wheel in villages where water was scarce. The pump would harness their energy to fill nearby tanks and provide communities in sub-Saharan Africa with fresh water. To make a long story short, the big rollout didn't work. Hobbs called it a Mad Libs version of a narrative we're all familiar with now. Exciting new idea, huge impact in one location, influx of donor dollars, quick expansion, failure. I am not suggesting by any means that all nature-based solutions are development efforts, nor that investing a lot of money in their implementation will lead to failure. But I found his reality check on scaling relevant, given the many opportunities today for fostering a nature-positive future. He criticizes the big idea, quote, that once you identify the correct one, we can simply unfurl it on the entire world like a picnic blanket. The point is, we don't know what works, where, or why. The only way to find out is to test these models, not just their initial success, but afterward and constantly. Liz Tully, the Associate Director of CAF, who is also here with us today somewhere, she's here, okay, says, we already have a lot of tools we need to leverage nature for more long-term resilience. I agree. She says it's the soft skills of dealing with uncertainty and continually reevaluating our actions and progress that are so challenging. I think there isn't one prescription. There are guardrails along many pathways forward. Irrespective of size, every endeavor will be boutique, highly dependent on what was and is possible in place. Nobody wants to hear that. But in the days ahead, I also hope we spend some time reconciling the big targets with local execution. Each place-based project has its own impact on its own, but together they can add up to a national response. Reaching great scale may depend more on mainstreaming the process of doing this work rather than repeatedly implementing the same solutions. I sometimes think of this as crafting a mosaic. How do we put together all these pieces to create something lasting and beautiful? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. All right, let's see if I can get the slides working. It's an honor to be here today and be with all these inspirational people working on inspirational ideas, and I'm really thrilled to be here. I know that as the federal government, I'm going to be talking less about story and more about a list of policy actions, but hopefully this will give us some fodder for conversation moving forward. And I do want to mention the National Climate Resilience Framework that Lauren mentioned has a section specifically on nature. So it talks about building more resilient nature as well as managing risks with nature. So it's embedded in the national framework. This administration sees nature as essential for achieving our national goals on climate change, equity, economic prosperity, and global competitiveness. And so there's a suite of different actions the administration has taken, and I'm only going to talk about a couple of them. So in Executive Order 14072, there were 3 different things called for in that executive order. The first was a report on key opportunities for greater deployment of nature-based solutions. And this would include anything that affects policy, guidance, or program changes in the government. Second is a guidance on valuing ecosystem and environmental services and natural assets in federal regulatory decision-making, which is very wonky, but is very important. And then the first ever national nature assessment. And so there is work underway to develop a national nature assessment that would come out in 2026. I'm not going to talk about that in great detail here because that's just a work underway, but it's really exciting that we're starting that process. So accounting for nature. Current national economic statistics, which are used to measure gross domestic product, or GDP, measure the U.S. economy in a manner that does not account for the role and value of underlying natural assets such as land, water, animals, plants. Without natural capital reflected in our national statistics, the United States cannot fully track the role of nature in driving economic growth or the loss of nature in slowing our economy, which makes it hard for public and private sector to plan for the future. So expanding national economic accounting system to include natural capital will allow us to incorporate it into our economic and other types of policies across the federal government, as well as in other jurisdictions and the private sector. So potentially significantly, could have significant impacts moving forward. There are now 27 federal departments and agencies incorporating, developing these accounts, and it's a 10-year plan. To fully develop it, we'll be able to start putting some of these accounts in place shortly. So moving forward, this will be developing and evolving. On nature-based solutions, a roadmap report was released in November of 2022 at the Climate Conference of the Parties. This report had a number of goals. The first was to provide a common vision of what nature-based solutions can achieve, to elevate nature-based solutions as a go-to option for climate, ecosystems, equity, and prosperity, on par with other tools that we see often in climate change, like renewable energy and electric vehicles, to show that we have decades of experience in nature-based solutions and know enough to scale up and start to build out, and to give agencies a strategic path to unlock the full potential of nature-based solutions. And then finally, to shine a light on opportunities to implement nature-based solutions in newer areas like hazard mitigation and reduction and infrastructure, where there was a lot of federal money going through the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law. So the definition of nature-based solutions used by the White House is very broad. Nature-based solutions are actions to protect, sustainably manage, or restore natural or modified ecosystems to address societal challenges, simultaneously providing benefits for people and the environment. So these can be large landscape actions, watershed restoration and forest management, local and parcel scale activities like rain gardens and bioswales, and can include both fully natural and non-structural actions as well as hybrided green-gray options where we combine them for things like living shorelines that have some built structures in them as well. There are a lot of different benefits. We just heard a lot about that from Lauren. So there's a lot of focus right now on risk reduction benefits of nature-based solutions, but there's also economic benefits, health benefits, and of course biodiversity and wildlife benefits as well. In addition to the roadmap, resources guide was put out in November that includes examples of over 30 agency projects and programs in nature-based solutions and over 175 different agency resources. So there's a lot of work that's been happening for decades, and this kind of rolls that all up. Going back to the roadmap, there were 5 strategic areas for action, and I'm going to quickly go through these and give a little bit of an update of what's been happening on all of these. So first, on the policy side of things, on accounting for nature and benefit cost analysis, the Office of Management and Budget has new guidance to better account for nature. I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. There's work underway to start thinking about how we expedite permitting and reviews as an interagency group that is trying to figure out how best to kind of build on models that are working and share information across the federal government. There's also work to embed nature-based solutions in alternatives that are required for federal decision-making in different processes so that it has to be a consideration and an option on the table. And one of those is in the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then there's a number of different agency-specific activities underway, including sustainability directives, nature-based solutions roadmaps in agencies, and other specific guidelines and policies that are being put in place. So accounting for nature. So those who don't know about benefit cost analysis, probably a lot of you do. It's essential for a lot of federal programs. It underpins decisions, so benefit cost analysis is used on major regulations, on programs, and on project funding for most federal agencies and most federal programs. Right now, costs and benefits from changes in the environment are often not fully accounted for, so we're missing some of the cost to impacts and the opportunities and benefits. And the modernizing regulatory review process underway has updated a number of different guidances in the Office of Management and Budget. For those who know, Circular A4, Circular A94, and there's a new ecosystem services guidance to support agencies doing better in this realm. In the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, which has been on again, off again across administrations, it requires agencies to avoid floodplain impacts to the extent possible. And it says if you have to do something in the floodplain, you should be considering nature-based solutions as an option to address those and mitigate those impacts to the floodplain and the floodplain functions. On the funding side of things, there's been a lot of money moving through the federal government through bill and IRA. And as those notices of funding opportunities move through, there's been a real effort to make sure it's clear where nature-based solutions are an option on the table or to encourage nature-based solution in a number of those programs. So for example, Department of Transportation has the PROTECT program, which is for resilient infrastructure, and nature-based solutions is part of that. NOAA has a coastal resilience program right now that's building a lot of nature-based solutions into the funding opportunity. And FEMA's BRIC program also has nature-based solutions. I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. And there was some work to understand what's been happening in the private sector, and we collected information on $66 million in new commitments by non-federal partners. The Federal Emergency Management Agency's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program is one of the larger programs across the federal government to build resilience, and they now give points for projects that include nature-based solutions. And moving forward, they're thinking about how do they encourage more nature-based and larger nature-based solutions as elements in these projects. So there's a definite effort here to encourage the use of these. I also want to mention the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. There's $22 billion in two different programs, the National Climate Investment Fund and the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator. This funding is really focused on greenhouse gas reductions and air pollution in low-income communities, and mobilizing finance and private capital. A lot of it's thinking about things like rooftop solar. But if you look at the additional benefits there, there's a bunch of resilience-related benefits that I think will be places where nature-based solutions could fit in. And this could be an opportunity to really leverage federal money to play around with private capital and finance to figure out how we better bring private capital into nature-based solutions. In our third area on federal assets, this is federal lands and waters as well as facilities. I think the most exciting thing is a new federal climate adaptation planning process that's now required annually. I'm going to just jump to that. These climate adaptation plans, every agency has to come up with, identify the impacts of climate change on their facilities and their ability to do their mission and programs, and then develop a strategic plan for how they're going to adapt and build resilience in. And nature-based solutions is a key element of this. There's nature-based solutions resources for them, as well as resources built from the program that Lauren just mentioned on how to adapt your natural systems and others over time to climate change. And this will have annual reporting on nature-based solutions achievements by the agencies. On the workforce side, there's been a lot of work on technical resources to support development of nature-based solutions and interagency knowledge sharing. On the workforce side, there's a new NOAA program to develop coastal resilience-related workforce. And the Climate Corps, which was recently announced, has a Forest Service program with $15 million to engage young adults in a variety of different kind of nature management projects. So I think a first step into building a workforce that we really need to build out. And then fifth, strategic areas for action and evidence and innovation. There have been some technical working groups across the federal agencies to help address some challenges like greenhouse gas monitoring and a bunch of different evidence-based resources that have been brought forward. And then finally, I just want to touch on where I think federal external partners can help the federal agencies move forward on a number of these ambitions. So I think we need to help our states use federally funded, federal formula funding program money. So the Environmental Protection Agency gives a lot of money to water programs in the states, the state revolving funds, for example. There's similar programs for DOT, for FEMA, for BRIC and HUD. So lots of opportunities to work with states to integrate nature-based solutions into these programs. There's also opportunities to incorporate nature-based solutions into rebuilding after disasters as we build back better. We also need to help train key partners on the ground, permitting officials, resilience officials, oversight boards, and city planners. And we need to share the stories about what's working and what's not. And we also, as we're building technical capacity in communities on the ground, there's a lot of work underway and new programs. We need to make sure nature-based solutions is incorporated into those programs. And I think on the workforce side, the government's just tip of the iceberg, started some programs there. There's a lot of work needed to get the capacity we need on the ground. We heard a lot from stakeholders that there were not sufficient people in engineers, landscaping firms, planners, landscape architects that are knowledgeable about nature and how to incorporate it into projects on the ground. And there may be opportunities for certification programs as long as they're inclusive to help support moving forward nature-based workforce. And then on the science and knowledge and evidence side of things, a lot of work is needed still to evaluate the effectiveness of these projects, performance and reliability. There's a lot of uncertainty. We need to build in adaptive management, but we need monitoring, and federal programs don't do a great job of supporting monitoring, as do other funders also lack that a bit. So we need ways to start collecting what's working, what's not working, and as these are going to be very variable, in place and community. We also need to build this knowledge into scenario models to allow decision makers to test out different approaches and determine which options will work best for them. And we need to increase the way we're integrating Indigenous knowledge on nature-based solutions. A lot of these, there's a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge that we need to capture and bring in so that we do this the best we can. So I think that the goal here is not, by the federal government, is not to require nature-based solutions everywhere, but to make sure nature-based solutions are considered as an alternative or an add-on for projects, and that they're eligible in funding programs, encouraged where it makes sense, and where we can achieve project goals to gain multiple co-benefits. NBS, nature-based solutions like renewable energy and electric vehicles, provide a tool to address climate change. In this case, both climate reduction through natural climate solutions and resilience building. And these need to be scaled up rapidly to kind of meet the needs of the time. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. Great comments from my shared panelists today. I will echo some of their sentiments. However, I'm bringing a different perspective, more so from the equity approach, and then also speaking a little bit about what the private sector is doing in this space and arena. I'm Crystal Upperman. I'm a senior manager at Deloitte in our Sustainability, Climate, and Equity Strategic Growth offering. I also have the pleasure of serving as on the board for We Act for Environmental Justice, which is the oldest environmental justice organization in the United States. I'm also a trustee for the Nature Conservancy's Maryland, D.C. chapter, and also I'm on the board of visitors for the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. Today, we're thinking about nature and nature-based solutions across the board, and what do private industry companies have to do with that? At Deloitte, we did a survey this year in 2023 of C-level business leaders, and it was a sustainability report across the board to see what people were thinking about this issue of sustainability. And we found that 61% of these C-level leaders said that climate change will have a high to very high impact on their organization's strategy and operations over the next 3 years. So there is no need to convince the industry, private industry, understands and recognizes that this is a problem for business operations, period. Not only was that an issue, the individuals that we interviewed, themselves, about 82% of them said that they were personally impacted by a climate-related event personally. So we're seeing this issue come up primarily for organizations, but we're seeing it come up for the people who are responsible for making the decisions in the organizations. So as our dialogues around climate change and natural resource management have intensified over the last decade, the terms nature-based solutions, nature-climate solutions are only now coming to the forefront as critical interventions and sometimes necessary alternatives to gray infrastructure. And this is great. It's necessary for us to make sure that we are able to meet greenhouse gas reduction and climate resiliency goals. We're continuing to see shifts in our management of natural resources that reflect these challenges in discourse. People are talking about it. Rivers are being allowed to have their natural course. Rejuvenated floodplains are happening instead of sole reliance on dams. But fragile ecosystems like coastal belts, small islands, underscore the vitality of green infrastructure as barriers and buffers against natural calamities. Nature offers protection. It offers sequestration and improved resilience at often lower costs, while delivering additional long-term societal and environmental benefits. In previous years, the use of nature-based solutions across the US government agencies and corporations was limited. If not, it was non-existent or even underfunded, and often only possible when tied to extenuating circumstances. For example, one of my one of my colleagues recently on the panel mentioned about Rebuild by Design and Hurricane Sandy. That was a moment where there was an unlocking of significant emergency response funding, and part of it was actually used to create oyster castles to support shoreline resilience and mitigate flooding. Nature-based solutions is actually now being seen as a response to the cleanup of toxic sites. We're seeing more entities who are responsible for cleaning up contamination being reliant on nature-based solutions to help make sure that they revitalize the sites as they once were. So corporations in the past, yes, have rarely invested in nature-based solutions or even mitigating impacts on nature until it became more apparent that our planet's ecosystems were a linchpin for business continuity and supply chain. Even when that emerged as a critical challenge, investment in nature-based solutions was still almost exclusively conducted and done by companies, where part of their supply chain was dependent on nature. For example, right now we're working through our Climate Innovation Collaboratory with the University of Colorado Boulder to help a large agriculture company measure the effectiveness of their nature-based solutions to improve soil health and crop resilience. We also see a lot of activity around watershed management from large-scale beverage producers that are reliant on water. In the public space, you will see that organizations like Coca-Cola have released reports around this topic. In 2022, they released a report that was titled, How to Create Nature and Natural Capital Through Nature-Based Solutions. This report actually details some of the ways that they have integrated nature-based solutions into their portfolio. The use of nature-based solutions by governments and especially corporations is still not as integral in thinking around nature restoration and conservation or climate resiliency as we would like to see. We're still seeing instances where, for example, an energy company who uses water for their processes will build another cooling tower to comply with EPA standards and try to offset those additional emissions rather than plant trees along the upstream water resource to cool the water before it enters the facility. We need to embed green infrastructure and nature-based solutions into our societal DNA. Efforts such as the Army Corps of Engineering with Nature, the Council on Environmental Quality's Roadmap for Nature-Based Solutions, and the Roadmap for Climate Resilience are providing the groundwork for us to integrate nature-based solutions into our day-to-day. And it's really up to the rest of us to really help them take the next step. But in our journey towards a nature-positive future, we face some really stark reminders of the deep-seated inequalities that permeate our societies, especially when it comes to environmental burdens. Whether it's extreme weather events, fires, or even toxic pollutants we breathe, we know that the weight of those burdens is not shouldered equally. When discussing equity, particularly within the context of the environment, we delve into a very complex interplay of interconnected issues. These are anchored not only in our surroundings, but also in the rich tapestry of history and traditions from around the world. Our relentless pursuit of expansion and urbanization has exacerbated these inequalities. For example, our history of redlining neighborhoods and other exclusionary practices have disproportionately exposed communities of color to areas close to industrialized zones, bearing the brunt of air pollution. As we look to implement nature-based solutions, whether in a government or a corporate context, we need to make sure that equity-centered approaches are at the center of design, implementation, and sustainment. This is both to incorporate critical beneficial perspectives such as traditional ecological knowledge from indigenous peoples, as well as to ensure that the nature-based solution ultimately benefits each community appropriately. To do this, we've encouraged a discovery and identification phase that not only takes data-driven and qualitative approach to identifying communities impacted by the solution, but also identifies stakeholder groups that are critical to implementation and sustainment that, although may not be impacted by the nature-based solution, could strengthen and or benefit from it. Once identified, it is critical that the strategic engagement plan that involves these groups in every step of the process is leveraged. It needs to be leveraged so that the design is not only inclusive and equitable, but as you move through these phases of implementation and sustainment, these communities and organizations are part of the solution. As part of that engagement plan, frequent checkpoints and feedback loops to measure and monitor the efficacy of the nature-based solution and adjust it as needed will allow the solution to truly meet its objectives. Recently, we supported a commercial bank in mapping its portfolio of nature-related programs and risks. And as part of that overarching audit, we supported the identification of gaps in equity and local stakeholder engagement as a priority risk within the portfolio. Making that clear linkage between success and sustainability of a program or asset to equity and inclusive design helps to continue to push the needle on the value of equitable nature-based solutions and benefit sharing. So as we work with commercial clients, we are encouraging the incorporation of these equity-centered approaches into their designs and implementation of nature-based solutions, both to improve the efficacy of the solutions, but also to drive improved benefit sharing globally. Overall, we encourage everyone and anyone interested in nature-based solutions to design and implement with equity in mind to maximize the impact and also to bolster resiliency. Thank you.
All right, since we are representing the North America region, I do want to just call out that the Udall Foundation, part of the U.S. government and USGS, is moving forward with a climate and nature assessment. James, who's going to be speaking next, myself, and others, I think, are on the guiding committee of that, and I'm sure there are others in this room who are engaging as well, but look out for that. It'll be a 2-year process to get that out, but it's for all of North America, and it's really focused on not just lessons learned, but also recommendations moving forward. So these panelists contributed a lot of food for thought here. Before we really dive in, I wanted to just ask the panelists to dive a little bit deeper into some of the terms. So nature-based solutions, that's one term. Nature-positive solutions, natural climate solutions. Can you tease these out a little bit? Maybe, Lauren, you can start. You know, when does a nature-based solution contribute to nature? When does it contribute to climate change? What do these different terms mean? And maybe I've missed a term or two in there that you want to throw in.
There certainly are a lot of them. I like to think of nature-based solutions as the umbrella over them all to some extent, because it does seem like, every other one we've talked about can fit under that. So nature-based solutions, as we talked about, are addressing societal challenges, actions to protect or restore, better manage nature to address societal challenges. And then you can define those societal challenges from anything to many examples you've heard today already of problems with coastal erosion or flooding in communities, climate change, problems with urban heat island effect in urban communities, food production, food security. Anyways, these are all a suite, and we want to look at what nature can do to help address that problem. But obviously, I think, and that's actually a question I have for the group here. I think there are a lot of people coming at this from one direction or the other. Sometimes, like, I came from conservation, and now I'm thinking about all the benefits that nature provides people. Or people are here thinking, I came from thinking about the societal challenges. Oh, and now there's these other benefits that these solutions also provide biodiversity and our ecosystem functioning. So I think that might be something to think about throughout the conference, because we bring different perspectives. But really these solutions are simultaneously addressing both. Natural climate solutions under that umbrella generally are targeting the goal of reducing emissions. And nature positive, I think of it as probably just maybe the most loose one. We're not losing, we're not degrading, but we're gonna have a positive effect here. And I guess that maybe the last thing I'd add is that, and others might wanna comment on this, you had some great examples of things you're measuring and monitoring and want to, but there's obviously problems, and how we measure carbon sequestration and carbon emissions is not perfect either, but it is, there is a clear one thing we're looking at, whether it's CO2 or methane. When you start talking about, effects of reducing the risk of wildfire, or reducing the risk of a flooding event, or how much did this really cool that community, or how much did this benefit bring to the local community in terms of jobs and livelihood? Those all require different kinds of measurements and tools if you're going to start tracking them. And then if you start bringing in the effects of nature and nature exposure on human health and mental health, those are all really even more difficult things to monitor. So I would just say that it's another topic for conversation, is that as we think about expanding and a project that is delivering as many benefits as possible, if you want to monitor it and track it, those tools are also really critical.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So question for Dr. Olander. What happened to the Conservation and Stewardship Atlas that the President Biden had instructed DOI and CEQ to create in the 30 by 30 order?
Okay, just
maybe talk about that in the context more generally of nature-based solutions.
So I can't speak, I don't know exactly where that stands, but my understanding is that it's still underway, and there is...
And what is it?
Well, it is many things. I think, the idea is that it'll be a place where there'll be a bunch of different kind of resources on 30 by 30, on conservation across the federal government, maybe resources on the nature-based solutions. There'll be ideally some map-based tools, as well as things like story maps in there. There is a website designed and developed, but there are pieces still missing, and I think they're not ready to roll it out until they have all the pieces. So it's underway.
Thank you. All right, Crystal, this one is for you. Do businesses that you work with see nature-based solutions really as a strategy that's important in terms of their return on investment? Or to what extent is it really a PR effort that they're sort of being forced to demonstrate that they're playing in this field?
That's a really interesting question. I think that question hinges a little bit on greenwashing, the topic of greenwashing that you hear a lot that's out there. This actually speaks to the reason why standards are really important. Climate disclosure standards are necessary and essential because that is actually a risk. I will say that, organizations that I've interfaced with are very much looking at nature-based solutions as potentially low-hanging fruit. It is a solution in them achieving net zero. But it's not an easy solution, because if you are an organization that has a very diverse supply chain, it's very challenging to, one, identify what solution belongs where, interact and engage with the communities that you need to involve in making sure that that solution has efficacy and has staying power and lasting power. And then you're also coming up against sort of the global mantra of my nature is not your solution, which again further complicates things and becomes a risk. So I'll say that organizations that I've interfaced with have been very much upstanding about trying to make sure that they're actually doing the right thing and trying to be thoughtful about what solutions they're trying to implement. What we've heard across the board is that many of the ones who've trailblazed and have tried to do this right have done all of the easy things. All the low-hanging fruit have been implemented. It's now to the extent in which they need help with the really challenging, gritty stuff. And that's where, there is a barrier. There's a barrier there in trying to figure out what is the next best step for all of the challenging solutions that then can be implemented.
Thank you. Did either one of you want to comment on that as well, or are you? Okay, then we're going to go on. So I was talking to a couple of millennials recently, and yeah, they're an interesting group. And, they're really worried. They've been told their entire lives that they're going to have to deal with the climate change solution. And they're a little bit more focused on the climate change aspect of things than maybe the conservation side of things. And so this brings a question. So, I started off talking about the past conflicts between conservation and climate change. Do they have to be conflicts? Do we have to choose one over the other? How do we really go forward in this world, and how does diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice play into all of this in not a superficial way, but a meaningful way? So one or two of you can jump in.
Well, I'm happy to start, and I might start with talking about my daughter, who cares deeply about all of this. And I think, her experience with, her friends is very much that climate change is, they see it as an existential threat to, their future. They're scared by climate change. It's very tangible. They do think about broader sustainability issues as well, and biodiversity is kind of embedded in there, but I think it's not as immediate. And so they love nature and they want to maintain nature, but they don't necessarily see the kind of, it doesn't have that immediacy that climate change does to them. That doesn't mean it's not important and they don't want to have nature, but I don't think they see it as the primary focus. At least that's what I'm seeing. But I do think that there's going to be this conflict is not, people aren't going to be comfortable railroading like this community over nature or equity, particularly the community that my daughter's part of. So I do see this, that all the issues are on the table, and they're not just thinking about climate change, but climate change is the one that they fear the most, I think.
Well, I'm happy to chime in as a millennial. I will say, I'll disclose here. So this is really an issue and a problem. Deloitte actually did a survey this year, 2023, of millennials and Gen Z, the population, and 60% of millennials stressed that climate change was an issue, and 50% of Gen Zers actually did also. And these two generations are very much the generations who are putting pressure on their employers to actually address these issues. Climate change itself ranks among the top 3 for them, which is climate change, the cost of living, and healthcare. So it is an issue and a problem and concern. When you segment it in terms of, climate change and nature, I think overarching, I can't speak to that because I'm in a bubble myself. I tend to, have around me like-minded people, but I will speak from a more personal perspective. The nuance behind climate change and what it is it's very complicated topic. The barrier to entry is very high. So I can't fault a whole generation for not having a clear understanding of the nuances of what climate change is, solving climate change, and the necessary components that we need to make sure that there are policies and movements behind to make sure that we actually do solve climate change. So I'll say that the nuances are difficult to realize. You actually have to be really well-versed and deeply educated on climate science to truly understand that nuance. But I do think as a whole, the movement and the movement of a younger generation trying to advocate for climate change is really critical and important because, again, as was mentioned, we're being told that we are going to be responsible for solving this problem. When forecasts are, saying, by 2050, this is going to be an issue and a concern, it's really detrimental. That is, I will be an older adult by then, much older adult. And it's like, how do you solve a problem that you know is going to be something that you will have to advocate for later on into the future? So I think it's more of, once they get deeper into the topic, they may be able to identify and understand that this is a critical component to be solved and one of the contributing factors.
I'd love to just address your question, is it either or? One of the many people I interviewed for my book was Jodi, who runs American Forests, some of you may know. And he says so clearly, like, we can't do one without the other. Like, these are inextricably linked. I can't emphasize that enough. We cannot hit negative emissions. We cannot do anything, on the climate front without leveraging nature more. And obviously, doing that is going to benefit the way these ecosystems functions and biodiversity. And I guess my other point from the millennial perspective is I think that people latch on to the fact, and I do it myself in frustration of, here we're burning fossil fuels, here we're continuing this behavior that's very identifiable. But when you actually look at solving that, you're then adjusting supply chain issues. You're looking at, like, where did my coffee come from? All the way back to this farm. What were they doing? Did they have trees there? Could they have more trees there? What was the soil? You get to go all the way back to that source. But I still think we latch on to the idea that there's this one thing, the burning of fossil fuels, that's causing the problem. Whereas when you look at the conservation community or biodiversity, there is a suite of pressures causing degradation. But I guess the point is, even if, snap your fingers, let's reduce emissions, seems simple, it is very complex, as you say, and requires doing all those things that would help biodiversity, that would help conservation, that would help us get 30% by 2030.
Well, and I think, thank you for that. And I think, it is about finding and communicating and interweaving nature and climate change so that we're going to get somewhere. So we have some new questions coming in. So I just lost the question I wanted, but I'm going to go to this one instead. In what ways do each of you see outdoor recreation and trails helping to achieve durable nature-based solutions for urban communities and as sustainable rural economic drivers? So that's a very different aspect coming in. How does that play into nature-based solutions?
This is such an exciting topic for me, sorry. Because as someone who spent a lot of time in remote, forests, when I think of and again, I'm gonna talk about forests because I spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about and researching forests, but I think of forest as, this old growth, pristine, like what we're striving for, these intact places. But as part of the research for my book, I said, let's go to the other extreme. What is the urban forest? And how do you even define that? And what do trees do in urban communities? So I spent a lot of time interviewing people that are involved in urban forestry and open spaces, and went to conferences with rooms full of people doing this. And I guess the point that was so astounding to me is the urban context, you can see what nature does for people so much more intimately. Like the idea of, a forest that I can visit in California, how many people have gone to see the sequoias, or, it's an incredible experience, right? But on a day-to-day basis, the small parks we have and the trees we have that line our street, there's so much more interaction and there's so many more people that they're affecting. So I think the urban context is really where we have a chance to see, if you pause, how many benefits there are from nature. There's a lot of different, I'll just name some, from the astounding numbers on a patch of forest here and the cooling effect that has in a community. That also touches upon the equity issues of what communities, there's been some really cool work to show how that mapping of tree cover correlates with these redline communities that have all kinds of other challenges, and then they're not getting, the benefits of these trees in open spaces. Kids, there have been interesting studies showing that kids with more tree cover around their schools tend to have better test scores, lower incidences of learning disabilities associated with distraction. It helps children focus. I can go on and on. But I think that's a place that, as a conservationist, if you come from, I came from, again, pristine, intact, let's protect that. I was really awakened by, listening and seeing the ways in which parks and trees and the percent of tree cover in your community, like how that really affects your life.
So I'll just want to note, hopefully Chair Mallory in her remarks will touch on this, but there's an initiative on nature-deprived communities across the federal agencies to kind of bring more resources to bear and trying to kind of provide more capacity and resources to provide nature and nature access to communities. But more broadly, I think a lot of, that outdoor recreation can be a critical element in a lot of nature-based projects and is often the economic development portion, bringing people to these areas. It's helped provide economic development opportunities. So lots of different examples I've seen have an outdoor recreational element built into them. And it seems to be a kind of a critical part and one of the key co-benefits and economic benefits if you're going to do an economic analysis of a lot of these projects. So I think it's a key component.
Thank you. This is for Lydia and Lauren. Can we hear your thoughts on grappling with measuring something as subjective as place-based and even nebulous concepts like adaptation and resilience? So we talk a lot about the need for better monitoring, better measuring, but what does that actually look like? It's super complicated, and you might be able to weigh in too, Crystal.
Well, I'm happy to jump in. I think there's a real need to develop and identify some metrics for tracking some of these other outcomes. So we not just greenhouse gases, but we need to measure, flood reduction benefits, fire risk reduction benefits, other types of nature-based solutions benefits. And there are some examples. So I was talking the other day with someone here about National Fish and Wildlife Federation. They, on some of their grants, have brought in experts to do additional measurement of projects and identify flood reduction benefits of those projects and some other kind of critical measures. They're not easy to do. It's not something that a project's going to be able to monitor on its own or have the resources to do, but people are going to have to come back in to measure these things. They're going to have to provide additional resources for measuring some of these complex things. And so that was one thing we talked about. So it needs to be done. It's doable. But it's going to need resources and some focus around common metrics that we can use to compare. The other thing that I think is really interesting is just how do we assess success and performance and reliability on risk reduction if we can't, have a fire run through and test out whether it's working or not. Sometimes we get that opportunity, whether we want it or not. Sometimes we can do experimental tests of these things, but I think that's something we also need to, build in this adaptive management where the experiments are built into the program so we can track over time and learn, and then that'll inform as we move forward, because flooding and fire and these things are harder to assess success on, but it needs to be part of our design of our projects as well. So,
I get very excited about this topic too. With the Climate Adaptation Fund, I mentioned how we did a retroactive study to look at projects and what were successful about them. Part of that work focused on what are people monitoring and what makes for a more rigorous monitoring plan. This was actually, again, another example where partnerships came in. You mentioned in your talk how there are a lot of resources out there now and more funding coming in, but people don't like to fund monitoring, or monitoring something in 10 years or 20 years. They want the project implemented, they want a checkpoint in 2 years, and then we want some belief that it's still going to do its thing into the future. So what we found from that portfolio was projects that had really strong partnerships with universities or agencies that also had a research interest helped build more effective and longer lasting monitoring projects. So I think that just points to one point of the partnerships element. Another part that came out of that was this funding aspect. What if from a funding perspective, you get a grant, but there is a certain percentage of that allocated, from the government or from the private funders that are out there that is very specific to monitoring. A lot of times people are, propose their own budget, and then their monitoring is this thing at the end where they're like, I have to say how I'm going to track what I did, and that's this tack on. But if we change the paradigm and saying let's do this from the start. So then from a super nerdy perspective,
which I also like to do sometimes, is you know, there's like looking at the theory of change, right? When you design a project in the beginning, what are your goals? What are we coming together? What are we trying to achieve? That is also the moment to say, what are we tracking and how do we do it? In our portfolio of projects, a lot of the goals that were clearly articulated focused on and included the societal ones. Again, you know, when we started, as you heard, a lot of the goals were on biodiversity and nature and expanded over time. But what we found is that even if you were including those societal ones, they were harder to measure, and very few of them did that. So it says again, like if you're going to set that as a goal up front, you know, that's where we got to jump in. And then the last point I'd say, and maybe this comes a little bit from an international perspective, but in my book research, you know, I visited a number of projects that are funding towards putting funding towards monitoring, but the tendency now is to move towards these like remote methods. How do we do something on a smartphone? How do we use a satellite or a drone? How do we use maybe eDNA, you know, that gets taken from someplace and sent to a fancy lab to look at, you know, what species might be present? But I think it's really important to ask also upfront, how do we embed, you know, methods of monitoring in community that's also building capacity and is not just like taking information for some national or global assessment, you know, in a big data set, because that part of that also brings a lot of opportunity to a community.
Yeah, and from the corporate perspective, this idea of monitoring and data availability is definitely one that can hamstring the forward momentum, to be honest with you. Moving forward 10 years, how are you going to evaluate that if you invest in this intervention at this point, it will take 10 years for us to even have a data point? Imagine being a key decision maker. How are you going to weigh which investments your organization makes based off of the fact that monitoring is going to be challenging? And this is why it's really critical and important. Simple things like having easily downloadable remote sensing data. I'm a scientist, and when I look at remote sensing data, the bands are just, they're confusing. How do we expect individuals who are really the key decision makers trying to pull levers on where they invest dollars to actually utilize the information that's out there to make decisions? And I think this is where it gets into identifying tools that can make some of the data that we have out there easier to use by a lay audience and the general public. I find that to be a big gap and a chasm, because then it requires experts like those on the panel here to have to engage, and those are few and far between. So how can we, you know, make sure that there's an opportunity to make sure that there are tools out there that have high efficacy behind them to bring forth decisions, support for decisions that need to be made via the data that we already have. But this idea around the monitoring is really a critical one, because you also want to be able to know whether or not a solution that you're investing in is actually causing damage. And you want to do that before the damage gets too severe. So even having warning systems within the monitoring process is something that's been requested a lot.
So I just wanted to add one thing, and amazing points from everyone. But I just wanted to point out that for the federal government and for federal programs, it's difficult, and we haven't really figured out, I think, how to build adaptive management, the experimental adaptive management that we actually need for nature-based solutions into federal programs. And so I think that's something where we could use help and thought partners on how best to do that, and how to do that with the authorities of different agencies, which is complicated. So just another need, I think.
So why is this audacious vision, right? And it's at a 2,000-mile scale. It's not even at a North America scale. But really everything that happens at on-the-ground projects, right? And ultimately they mount up. And my question to Lauren and to Crystal is, you know, you're talking a lot about individual projects, and you know, the WCS Climate Change Adaptation Fund was really ultimately about small spatial scale projects, really as models to try to push things forward. But how do we get to scale? How do we go from great models to having that be the norm at scale across North America?
Well, I'm happy to go first on this question. I think the federated nature of the way we make decisions and policies makes it such that it is essential and necessary for us to have cross-sector, cross-government communications and partnerships and collaboration. We are not going to be able to make sure that the great knowledge that is coming out of academia actually gets turned into policy that then bolsters action and response by the general public and also industry. So across the board, I think one big opportunity to get to scale is to continue having conversations that aren't siloed. Aside from that, I also think that making sure that we are bringing the general public, and I'm using that broadly, I think of them as the grassroots, whether that's rural, urban, indigenous, having those be a part, those communities be a part of discussions and topics to make sure that every increment of an idea, even if it's a silly idea, is considered, because you just never know what could be the linchpin for flipping the switch to make sure that, we have some breakthroughs. So I think those are two of the key things that I see as really important to bring about scale. There are a whole host of others, being able to accurately price an intervention and be able to do the cost evaluation, because there are these intangible benefits that we get from nature. It makes it really hard to truly account for what the total cost and benefits actually are. How do you even evaluate the feeling that you get from driving through a well-forested area? We don't know how to account for that. And then also sort of the financing aspect of these projects, making sure that they are a mainstay to then kickstart, even if it's piloting and then using that pilot to continuously improve across the board. I think if we need to see more of that at scale, those are just a couple of the things, but I'm sure that panelists here have quite a few additions to make.
Yeah, I was thinking about, we targeted lots of different kinds of projects in different ecosystems, but over time, we also started to see patterns of tools that were being used in multiple places in different ways. And I guess this points to, as we're sitting here, I'm thinking about like the consistency of climate threats. Like if you're working in a forest ecosystem that's threatened by wildfire, we might address that differently one place to another, but there are certain tools that are a suite, out there now to choose from. But then it's not just about what you're doing, again, the process of doing this work. How do you do it with communities that are in that one place, that are then, monitoring and evaluating and rechecking along the way. So I guess I think of it as these two ways, is like the tools that are out there for your given climate problem or societal problem, then your place-based strategy and your process of doing the work. So just in our last couple of years with the Climate Adaptation Fund, we opened up this mainstreaming fund, and that was the idea behind it. Of we were seeing projects, we've done this before, it's not entirely innovative, but it was another ecosystem that had a fire problem or that had a water problem, and they were using beaver mimicry or something. So we kind of had these lists of these are projects we're seeing lots of groups on. We'd love to have someone propose, how do we do this in more communities and more places. And I would just comment on that when we saw those good proposals come back, it wasn't here are the tools we're going to go to a bunch of different communities and implement. It was here are a bunch of places facing similar issues. Here are the communities and partnerships and relationships and people that we think can help address them. Here's how we're going to get to them and work with them and bring them together to try to then pick up these tools. So I think that's an aspect of the scaling is how do we bring tools of methods or an approach or a solution that we think work into a place affected by a similar issue, and then let people and community and the leaders there take control or figure out how best to do that.
Locally led is what
I'm so sorry, Lydia. We are over time, and there are about 300 more questions that you all in the audience asked. And so I'm just going to say, make sure you have lunch with these folks. We're going on break. Don't let them get to their coffee. Ask them questions. So I think we're on break now. Thank you again to all three of you for your great insights.
Thank you, gang, and be panelists while they're trying to grab a snack and maybe some water. And I do just want to say, you know, Lauren, you referenced your book over and over and over again. It's available out in the lobby, In Search of the Canary Tree. There you go. So we've got some available. So, gang, promises. It's 10:15 now. Can everybody be back by 10:25? Check your clocks. Goal for you, get some sunshine, meet somebody new. Thanks for a great kickoff this morning, everyone. We're on break.